Teguh kan?
Itu bahasa Inggris.
Nggak apa-apa.
Ya. Gimana? Mau kita mulai?
Oke.
Nunggu. Dimulai Mas Bagas? Baik ya. Saya awali dulu. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam.
Selamat siang buat teman-teman mahasiswa semuanya. Dan juga beberapa saya lihat juga teman-teman dosen. Baik yang dari UNSOED maupun yang dari luar UNSOED. Karena kita sebarkan link ini juga ke jaringan KIBI gitu ya. Harapannya bisa diseminasi ke teman-teman yang lain. Semoga kita semuanya dalam keadaan sehat dan selalu dalam lindungan Allah Subhanahu wa taala. Hari ini kita akan kedatangan tamu dan sudah datang begitu ya, salah satunya dari luar negeri, dari overseas. Seperti tahun-tahun sebelumnya, kita di program master juga menyediakan sharing ilmu lah dari teman-teman luar negeri. Dan pada kesempatan siang hari ini telah hadir bersama kita nanti Prof. Willems dari Belanda dan juga Prof. Teguh dari Malaysia. Untuk jelasnya nanti CV-nya mungkin Mas Bagas akan memberikan pengantar sebelum dimulai acara gitu karena beliau sebagai moderator. Tema dari kuliah kita pada hari ini adalah tentang masalah etik penelitian terkait dengan kondisi pandemik. Gitu. Saya memastikan beliau-beliau adalah narasumber yang sangat pas untuk memberikan insight kepada kita tentang ya tantangan, kemudian kendala etik, mungkin juga sampai ke prosedur teknis. Harapannya nanti ada diskusi yang agak teknis juga ketika teman-teman akan melakukan penelitian di lapangan, begitu bagaimana kondisi pandemik ini mempengaruhi pola atau prosedur penelitian yang harus mereka kerjakan seperti itu. Saya garis bawahi kuliah tamu ini merupakan kerjasama antara program Master Biomedik FK UNSOED, kemudian bagian Bioethics FK UNSOED, dan juga kantor internasional UNSOED atau IRO gitu. Nanti secara perjalanan dari kuliah ini akan dipandu oleh Bu Woro dan Mas Bagas, dan mungkin juga nanti saya sekalian pamit ya karena pada jam yang sama, jam ini udah mulai ini ada rapat senat universitas yang harus saya ikuti, dan karena terkait dengan jabatan fungsional teman-teman FK juga, jadi kalau tidak hadir kan lucu gitu loh. Kita mengusulkan jabatan fungsional, jabatan itu tapi kok wakilnya tidak hadir. Jadi sekalian juga nanti saya pamit begitu. Harapnya sih nanti bisa lancar dan teman-teman dari mahasiswa ataupun yang ikutlah dalam acara siang hari ini bisa ikut berkontribusi, diskusi begitu ya, interaktif untuk kemajuan bersama. Demikian pengantar dari saya. Waktu dan tempat saya kembalikan ke Mas Bagas walaupun tadi belum diserahkan ke saya gitu ya. Gitu ya. Saya akhiri. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Monggo Mas Bagas.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Terima kasih banyak Pak Lantip. Selamat mengikuti sidang senat. Semoga lancar acaranya. Baik, pada kesempatan siang hari ini kita ada dua pembicara yang mana nanti akan diperkenalkan secara langsung oleh Ibu kita, Ibu Amalia Muhaimin, yang akan memperkenalkan para pembicara, sekaligus juga akan mendampingi sesi diskusi bersama Ibu Woro. Ya, kepada Bu Meli, kami persilahkan.
Ya, terima kasih Mas Bagas. Ya kita membagi tugas ya. Terima kasih. Terima kasih Pak Lantip. Selamat datang semuanya kepada para peserta, baik dari Indonesia maupun dari Malaysia yang sudah bergabung. Hari ini kita ada kuliah tamu. Saya tidak apa-apa ya bahasa Indonesia aja ya sementara ya. Sebelumnya saya perkenalkan dulu Dr. Teguh ini adalah dokter lulusan FK UGM ya. Dari asli Yogyakarta, Wong Jowo ya Pak Teguh ya. Kemudian beliau ini mengambil S3 doctorate study di Kobe University Jepang. Kemudian mengambil postdoctorate di University Science Malaysia, di mana beliau akhirnya bekerja di sana cukup lama ya Pak Teguh ya, di USM. Setelah itu juga beliau sempat menjadi jadi research fellow di Department of Biomedical Ethics di Osaka University. Kemudian untuk work riwayat bekerjanya, beliau selain di USM dan IMU Malaysia, sekarang beliau adalah sebagai Deputy Director of Center for Research Excellence di Perdana University Malaysia. Dan juga beliau adalah salah satu anggota dari member of Research Ethics Committee di FK UNSOED ya. Sudah sering banyak sekali membantu kita. Baik, saya kira Pak Teguh, the floor is yours. The time is yours. 40 menit, is it okay? 40 minutes for lecture?
Okay, I think it's okay. I hope to complete the lecture within 20 minutes, and then we can spend more time to discuss.
Oh, great. Okay.
Discussion. I hope.
Okay. Silakan.
Nggak janji maksudnya.
Oke, it's okay. Mau PHP ya.
Okay.
Silakan.
Okay. Can everyone see my screen? Yeah.
Yes, we can see your screen.
Good. Okay. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you, Dr. Amalia, Dr. Raditya, Dr. Lantip, for the invitation to this lecture. My lecture, as it was written in the invitation, was about human subject recruitment in clinical trials. I believe being a master student yourself, I think recruitment into clinical trials are not something very foreign. It's not something very foreign. It's not something new for many of you. The principle is simple, autonomy and so on. What I'm going to present today is something rather different that I try to propose and ignite some discussions. This is stemming from what happened in Indonesia a few months ago, where military personnel were recruited into clinical trials. So what will be the problems in there? And then is it moral to do that? Do you have moral basis to do that? Right. So that's the discussion will revolve around that issue. This slide is about, I think, the most important principle, the most important problems in every clinical research. Not many people know probably Dr. Kristen Grady. Dr. Kristen Grady is a very well-known figure in bioethics. She's one of the authors of this book, Principles and Practice of Clinical Research. But Dr. Kristen Grady, not many might know it, that she's also the wife of a very well-known figure in the United States. She's the wife of Anthony Fauci. That's so he's quite a celebrity for the last few months during this pandemic. Dr. Kristen Grady said in this book that the primary ethical tension in clinical research is that a few individuals are asked to accept some burden or risk as research subjects to benefit others and society. So this is the main problem when you have clinical research. You ask a few individuals to sacrifice. So that's why when we see people participating in clinical research, subjecting themselves to a totally unknown substance to be injected into their body, so that means they are accepting the burdens of risks. Okay? This burden of risks is necessary so that clinical researchers can determine the efficacy and safety of that particular substance before it can be, before the regulatory body can approve that for wider usage within the community, within the society. So therefore, sacrifice and altruism is the most important principle in recruitment of human subject participants. Altruism is very, very important. It's probably the single most important principle. Altruism is an ethical doctrine that holds that individuals have a moral obligation to help, serve, or benefit others, if necessary, at the sacrifice of self-interest. More precisely, an action is morally right if the consequences of that action are more favorable than unfavorable to everyone else except the agent. Yeah? So here, that what it means altruism. So everyone else get the benefits except you yourself who sacrifices. So that's altruism. So that's true for whenever clinical research participants get involved in clinical research. So that's what happened. Well, you do pay them, but that payment is not meant to replace the sacrifice. No payment can replace the sacrifice, because the sacrifice, the risk is a lot higher than that, right? Many of them are known risks, right? Okay, so this is the this is underlined. Yeah? I understand this is something rather different when we talk about recruiting human participants into clinical research. The first thing that comes into mind is autonomy. But let's talk about that later. Let's understand this first. That the first thing that comes into mind is when we talk about human participants in research is sacrifice and altruism. That they have sacrificed themselves to for the benefit of others, of the wider society. Now, in the mainstream idea on how research, clinical research is done, the objective of altruism is achieved through autonomy. Yeah? It's achieved through autonomy. Okay, when you have autonomy means, you can see the definition of autonomy in the context of clinical research in the ICHGCP, the good clinical practice, the principles of doing clinical trials. Freely given informed consent, this is contextualized in that, freely given informed consent that should be obtained from every subject prior to clinical trial participation. There is some special groups that you have to pay attention to, vulnerable groups in the context of superior-subordinate relationship, minors, mentally challenged, and so on. But basically, in autonomy, every individual should be guaranteed a free choice whether to participate or not to participate. That is the principle of autonomy. In that principle of autonomy, because of that principle of autonomy, then you can assume that people who finally decide to participate, that participation is based on the idea of altruism, the willingness to sacrifice for the greater benefit of society. He or she knows that his or her sacrifice of getting the drugs, which nobody ever known, whether it will cause good or harm, that will be such a knowledge will be achieved because of that, and then it will eventually benefit society. So that's how, in the mainstream idea on how altruism is achieved in clinical research, which is through the principles of autonomy. But a few months ago, we know that there is clinical trials meant to try new combination of drugs, yeah, to treat COVID-19. And then for the here it says I cannot read this one. Okay, it says here, there is one member of parliament said here, the clinical trial was quickly completed because of collaboration with the army, taking advantage of the new COVID-19 cluster in one of its military training schools. There was, at that time, we have many military personnel got infected with COVID-19, and we took advantage of that situation where we recruited, where the researchers recruited participants from among the military personnel to try this new combination of drugs. So there's a problem here, which is their status as a military personnel. It doesn't happen only in Indonesia, but I assume presumably it also happens in China. Well, China approves COVID-19 vaccine for military use, and that skips final phase of testing, skips phase 3 trial. This was posted in June 2020. China's Central Military Commission approved the use of vaccine by the military on June 25th for a period of 1 year. CanSino said in a filing. CanSino declined to disclose whether the inoculation of the vaccine candidate is mandatory or optional. Yeah. Okay, so now in the context of military involvement in clinical trial, when you recruit military personnel into clinical trials, is altruism still applicable? And then there is another question, is principle of autonomy practical still with military hierarchy? And is it morally acceptable then? Okay, all right. So now let's look. Let's see. I want to look at the second question first. Is principle of autonomy practical with military hierarchy? So we understand in the military hierarchy, they have a very rigid chain of command, and everything you cannot release anything from that military nature, from the command chain. Yeah, as long as you are a military personnel, so then you have to really pay attention to that. And we understand at the outset of the clinical trial itself, the chief of staff of the army was involved. So there is a good chance that actually the command, there is an instruction comes from the chief of staff for the army personnel to actually get into the trial itself. Then something, so then the way they were recruited was through instructions, presumably. Even if it's not, then let's say you have the proper informed consent procedure, then it should be questionable whether the component of autonomy is still there. Then you know there is a word from the chief of staff for those personnel to get involved into the clinical trials, and then you are handed over with the informed consent document, and then you are told it is free for you whether or not to get involved or not to get involved. But see who is giving the instructions. That's the chief of staff. So you can see the problems there. Yeah, it's very difficult. the principle of autonomy is very difficult with military hierarchy, then is it morally acceptable to actually recruit military personnel into the clinical trials? Right? Let's go back to the principle of altruism, the very basic principles where recruitment of human participants should be based. Now, altruism and autonomy. Altruism may be expected from an autonomous decision making. That's what we have agreed on earlier. So when you are deciding something with autonomy, then you can be expected to make an altruistic decision. That the basis of your decision is altruistic. Yeah? But autonomy itself is not a prerequisite for altruism. Yeah? Autonomy itself is not a prerequisite for altruism. Altruism may be achieved, yeah, by something else than autonomy. Okay. And then on the other hand, altruism itself is not always an objective of autonomous decision making. Yeah? A person may act voluntarily or autonomously because of non-altruistic motives. Yeah? When, for example, I want to buy a laptop, which is very good, with what, 1,000 US dollar, 10 million rupiah, about 3,500 ringgit Malaysia. I do it voluntarily, I do it autonomously, but it's not an altruistic motive. It is because I expect some benefits from that, from purchasing that thing. So that's the thing. Yeah? A person may act voluntarily or autonomously because of non-altruistic motives. Vice versa, altruism can still be achieved by other means than voluntary or autonomous process. Now, this is the problem that I have mentioned earlier. Is autonomy applicable in military system? Altruism is inherent in existence of military of every nation to protect the nation, of course. One cannot become military personnel unless motivated by altruistic basis, readiness and willingness to sacrifice oneself. This is really a special set of individuals. Yeah? You cannot join an army without an altruistic motives, because what you put at stake is really your life, right? And altruism in military is free from principle of autonomy. In fact, individual autonomy is not recognizable in military system. Once you join an army, then I don't think there is once you join an army, then I don't think the principle of autonomy is still applicable in any army in the world. Yeah? Example here, no nation would require the military personnel to sign informed consent for going to war, right? You don't have to, no military personnel have to sign an informed consent for going to war, really. Yeah. Now, would risks of injury or death in clinical trials supersede the risk of injury or death in war? Sometimes it can be yes, it can be no, but it may be not bad, yeah, if I try to compare between going to war and participating in clinical trials for military personnel. So therefore, from this perspective, in the military context, for military personnel, while the moral basis of autonomy cannot be applicable, then there is another moral basis for participation of military personnel, which is the principle of duty. Once every military personnel join into the military or join into the army, so they are bound to duty. So that becomes their moral compass. That becomes their moral basis, duty, the principle of duty. So that's the same. You are going to war is because you are guided by the principle of duty. It is your duty for going to war. So then, in a sense, it gives an alternative moral basis for involving military personnel into joining clinical trials, which is principle of duty, which is no longer autonomy. Yeah. But there is a limitation to the moral ground, of course. Yeah. Most, if not all, for now, clinical trials are sponsored by pharmaceutical companies, pharmaceutical drugs. And being companies, they all have business motives. They all have commercial motives. So then the purpose of having autonomy, one of the purpose of having autonomy is to protect the participants from being exploited by the sponsor of the clinical trials. In a sense, now you are involved, now the participants are involved with minimum payment, but then later on, it is when the drug is already approved, then all the profit goes to the commercial entity for the business. Yeah. So then there is a limitation to this moral ground. This is very much. That will be very much of an irony if we apply the principle of duty when recruiting participants, while on the other hand, then will the drug or vaccine go commercial? Yeah. Yeah. Who will benefit from the commercial from the profit of it? Yeah. Who will profit? Yeah. So that's why then such limitation we have to be very, very careful, because it is a very delicate matter. So in a summary, yeah, I can mention that altruism provides the basis of individual participation in clinical trials. This is really the first and the most important, I think, basis for human participation in clinical research. The problem is that altruism is not something operational. You cannot operationalize altruism. One way of operationalizing altruism is through autonomy. So that's why it is actually autonomy who is present as a principle in recruitment of human participants. But on the other hand, altruism is not dependent upon autonomous decision-making or participation. And then individual autonomy may not be applicable in recruitment process of clinical trial in military, where participations can be seen as more of a duty. So for military personnel, the case what we had in Indonesia, where military personnel were recruited, it can still be morally justifiable when we see it from the perspective of the principle of duty. So that's what I propose as a moral basis of recruitment of military personnel. I have a chance to outline this thought in an online newspaper in The Conversation. It was published in October the 6th. You can ignore the word scandal there. That's from the journalist to make it eye-catching, really. But the real questions is that can a chief of staff of a military of army instruct their his members to become clinical trial participants for COVID-19? So I have a more I have outlined the thought that I have talked about in this lecture, into that into this article. If you want to have a look at this article, you can click this link that I have down there. Okay, I think that's all what I can deliver for this lecture. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Teguh, for the interesting and intriguing, I think, presentation or lecture. It's quite interesting how we don't often think about altruism in relation to ethics or research, right? And how it relates to autonomy and also even duty, in this case, the military group. So, okay, I'll open for any questions. Silahkan. I see, I think Professor Dick Willems is here with us. Hi, hello, Dick. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello, Amalia. It was a bit difficult to get in, but I'm in. Yes.
Oh, it's so nice.
I'm happy.
Very early there.
I'll show my face as well, because otherwise you only...
Hai Pak Dik.
Yeah.
Apa kabar?
Hi, Teguh. How are you?
Hi, good.
How are you doing?
Long time to see you.
Okay. Yeah, that's a long time. I had about 20 minutes of your lecture, which I found very interesting. So I'm happy.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, and we're very happy that you can join the Teguh's lecture. We were sure that maybe you haven't heard of this news, Dick, in the Netherlands. So it's great that you have joined a bit of the Teguh's lecture. So any questions from participants, students, and friends from Malaysia are also here? Feel free to ask your questions, or you can also write them in the chat box, or you can also free to say your questions in Indonesia or Bahasa Indonesia or Melayu maybe, and we will try to translate it at our best. Okay, or Dick, do you have any comments for Teguh? Responses.
Oh yes, well I just heard half of the lecture, but I was very interested in what you were saying about the impossibility of autonomy for military personnel, and in my part I will come back to the issue of autonomy, because also in disaster research, often autonomy is very difficult for patients to obtain, because there's a lot of pressure and difficulty and stress, and it's often very difficult to step back and take an autonomous, well-considered decision in those situations as well. So I was really happy with your stress on autonomy. And altruism too is an interesting concept when you look at research, because the basic idea is that people participate in research not for their own good, but for the good of other patients or of society, if you want, or of science. But it's usually not because they get better from it themselves, because in some of the trials, they may only have more trouble because new drugs may have severe side effects that we don't know of. So it's not in their own interest very often. So there is some degree of altruism involved always, I think.
Yeah. I was wondering, while waiting for other questions, I have since you mentioned about duty and how this how do you say this condition in the military where there's a superior and subordinate. I was thinking of the setting in academic setting. Can we compare this also perhaps with research that are done in the academic setting, where we sometimes are not sure if we can write or publish or report this as a research, or is it simply some kind of I don't know, learning evaluation or something? Because then the question is whether or not students need to sign a consent form for instance, if we do some new learning methods and want to evaluate or assess that or evaluate that and make it report as a research. And also maybe further to the healthcare setting between doctors and patients. Like how does this view of altruism and also duty can also apply in other settings as well?
Well, the principle of altruism is always there whenever human participants are involved into research. But I think when we talk about non-military case, I don't think problem of superior subordinate relationship is much of a case really, because for example, like in educational research, on educations, we not most of the time, all the time, we are using students as subjects or participants. So that inflict superior subordinate relationship problems in there. And also when you mentioned about doctor-patient relationship. So but there are always ways on how to avoid that. And another thing is that in non-military relationships, they are not confined in the hierarchy. Although socially we have such a hierarchy, that's right. But the hierarchy is not as rigid as what we've seen the hierarchy in the military, which is very much fixed and institutionalized into an act. We have the military, we have military act. It's all there, and it's very, very embedded, fixed into their daily life, really. Such thing as perhaps the usual rights that we see in civil life. It's we cannot find it really in military life, right? Because that's not the purpose of how people build the military. Go back to the superior subordinate relationship. There are ways on how to avoid that. For example, I understand ethics committee would always avoid direct relationship between researcher who is also a doctor and his or her patients that he or she attended to be recruited into the doctor's research. So that, because that will always most of the time that will inflict such a problem. And then the same thing also happen when in educational research. You know, when you are teaching that particular students, most of the time getting in touch directly with that student, and they need to ask somebody else to do that. And there has always to be some sort of guarantee that participating or not participating will not affect anything. I think that's what I can share in that.
Yeah.
Can I say something about this issue? Sure. Educational relationships. We have a rule in our hospital that research with the students in our hospital we can't do research with our own students, let's say. So if you want to do research with students, then you have to go to one of the other hospitals the other hospital in the city. So this is sort of an exchange. If you want research, then you go to the different university, and the other university comes with research proposals to our university if they want to include students in educational research. It's not always possible, but it's one of the ways in which you can avoid students feeling pressurized because The doctor who will grade them eventually, who will give them their grade, is also asking them to participate in research, which is very hard to refuse then.
Yeah.
But it remains an issue, of course, because people may feel pressurized always to participate.
Yeah. That's really interesting, Dick. I didn't know that. It's an interesting way of avoiding this pressure. Thank you. No questions yet?
Okay, I have a question there.
I'm sorry?
Pauki in chat.
Oh.
Maybe it's a personal chat for Pak Teguh.
Oh yeah, I think that's right. It's a personal one. That's right. Pauki, I think I should read your question.
Okay, thank you.
Dari perspektif basic moral principle of bioethics, okay, I'll do it in English. From the perspective of basic moral principle of bioethics, we can understand that there are two conflicting dimensions. In one side, we need volunteers, which act on voluntary basis to get vaccinated, to participate in vaccination trials. And on the other hand, these military personnel cannot go against the military disciplines. So how are we going to find a way out, a win-win way out that is humanly acceptable? Should there be some kind of board that can facilitate this? What would be the format of the board? Okay. Well, I think that's this is really the problem, as I have proposed earlier in the lecture. Okay, that whenever when we recruit military personnel, there is always a question, a very, very big questions, whether the process is autonomous or not. But I try to argue there that I don't think the principle of autonomy is operational. Yeah. When we recruit military personnel.
Yes.
But then we need to look, I think, in my opinion, we need to look something higher than autonomy itself, which I propose as altruism. Yeah. Then when what we achieve is altruism, that altruism can be achieved not only by autonomy, but by the principle of duty, that you are bound to duty, that this is your duty.
Great.
So then I try to equalize going to participating in clinical trials for military personnel. I try to suggest that it's probably the same as going to war for military personnel. Nobody would ask you a informed consent before you go to war. Well, that's just so then that principle of duty serves as an alternative moral basis for the participation of military personnel in clinical trials. But again, we have to be very, very careful in applying the principle of duty when we do clinical trial, because we cannot always do that. We must not always do that. It's not something which is just routinely applicable. Really, it is applicable only in an extremely dire situations. So then again, how dire the situation can be, that will be a subject of debate also.
Can I just add something in the discussion again?
Yes.
You might, there's been a discussion in some of the bioethical journals about the question if participation in scientific research is an obligation for everybody. So not only for the military, especially the English bioethicist John Harris, you might look at one of his papers. He says participation in scientific research is a moral obligation for all of us, because science is good for all of us, and we have an obligation to do what is good for all of us. And then, so that's his reasoning. He says, in fact, we all have an obligation, but obviously it's not, I'm not under any circumstances, and not for every research, but he says there's a part, as soon as you benefit from medicine or from healthcare, then you also have an obligation to do something back. And that something back may be that you try to advance medicine and healthcare, and you can do that by simply participating in research. Obviously not research that's very burdensome, or that's, I mean, there's no obligation, it's not an infinite obligation. You can say that some research is too risky or too burdensome, and people really have to consent on their own. But in fact, he says there's an obligation on the part of everybody. But I agree with you, of course, that military personnel has a lot more difficulty to refuse participation. But so the notion of obligation has been, there's a large discussion about that issue, whether this is an obligation on the part of the people who benefit from the research that has been done previously to participate in further research. Don't know what you think about that, Teguh, but
well, to me, the problem here is they're always the outcomes. Yeah, the end of the end of the research itself, because most of the time, if not all, the clinical trials will end up with commercial products, something that you will commercialize. So that is always the problem. That will be an irony if we apply the principle of obligation for the out of the basis that there is a benefit to the society, while in the end we know who benefits profitably, right, from that clinical trials. So that's why that limits the extent where principle of duty can be applied, I think.
It's very interesting discussion. Are there any other questions? I'm interested to know, actually, because Teguh, you wrote this in a public newspaper, or if you have received any comments or responses, especially from people from the research ethics in communities in Indonesia. There's also, I see here Bu Wahyu, who is now head of our research ethics committee and also active in our national our national research ethics, national ethics committee, and also Bu Azwani. Welcome, Bu Azwani, who has joined us. If you Teguh, first of all, if you have, my first question is if you have received any comments or responses.
No, I haven't received. But I saw some comments on the Twitter itself. Okay. But on the Twitter, the article was tweeted quite a number of times, and there are people commenting on that. Yeah, I don't see much of a discussion there in the Twitter itself. But it's really one way is perhaps just simply of an option, which principle that we want to use. Probably I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, we have here a big WhatsApp group. It's called Indonesian Bioethics Forum, and there has been, I think, if I recall, many not many, but people are mostly have objected to this.
Yes.
And I can understand. I think my first reaction was also a bit shocked. I was shocked and surprised, but I think I still, because I don't know how they conducted the research technically, how they recruited the so I couldn't say anything more. But it's interesting that it's not much discussed in Indonesia from the research ethics.
First I first presented this proposal in the Gajah Mada University Center of Bioethics when they have their anniversary, and there was a panel there, and at that time there was not much discussion because really the panel just mentioned that their experience in the ethics committee in Gajah Mada, where they deliberated the case of recruiting military personnel into clinical trials, and their answer was just a flat no.
Okay.
It's just a flat no. This is leaving no room for discussion, really. Yeah, I mean, well, being humans, you are just trying to find excuses on what you are doing. Well, there's still a moral principles, a moral basis in doing that.
Yeah, thank you. We have 5 minutes left. If there are any questions, Bu Wahyu, are you there? Bu Sandari is our head of currently now head of our research ethics committee in FK UNSOED, and also she's a member of the national recognized research ethics committee in Indonesia. If I was wondering if she had heard or had discussed this in the national level of the research ethics community. Bu Wahyu, are you there, or I don't know. I see her name. I don't know. Okay.
Sorry, Dr. Amalia,
yes.
Pak Dik, and everyone. I have to join exam board meeting in 5 minutes.
Oh, yeah, right.
I will remain here, but probably I'm going to be too lalit.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I forgot you have another meeting. Okay, thank you very much, Teguh.
Thank you. I will remain here, but I'll be another.
Okay.
This is also an online meeting.
Okay, don't disturb your other meeting. Okay, yeah. Thank you very much. Okay, so I think we will continue now with the second lecture from Professor Dick Willems. Bagas or Woro, could you please share the screen? I'll tell you a little bit about Professor Dick Willems. Professor Dick Willems is a medical doctor by training from the AMC Amsterdam, and he has also graduated from philosophy, as I know, right? And pursued a PhD in also philosophy, and he has been professor in medical ethics at the AMC since 2003, I think, and is currently chair of chair of the Healthcare Ethics Committee at the AMC, and I think now member of the AMC's Research Ethics Committee still. And he is also now the head of the Department of Ethics, Law and Humanities of the Amsterdam University Medical Center. So yeah, I think Dick, I will give the time to you for the lecture.
Thank you very much. I'd like to try to share, excuse me, I'd like to try to share my screen with you. Don't know. So even that works over this huge distance that we're very close, but very far from each other, I think. So I'll just try to put this on full screen. So can you see my screen there?
Yes, we can see your screen clearly.
Ooh. It's unbelievable always, I think, that you can see what I'm seeing in this. So I put the title Ethics of Research in Disaster Situations to my lecture. And it will mainly be about, I mean, obviously we are globally in a disaster situation now. I can tell you that in the Netherlands, things looked like going quite well at the end of November with the COVID situation. But since the day before yesterday, we are back in a complete lockdown that was like we were in March and April. That was the time when Amalia had to leave Holland in a rush because we were getting we were locked down, and it was quite difficult for you to get back to Indonesia, if I recall, Amalia.
Yeah.
So You're very lucky not to be here now, because really everything is closed down for about 5 weeks, which includes Christmas and New Year's Eve. So it's really getting worse again. Numbers are increasing. I don't know how Indonesia is doing, but well, what I'm be talking about is the ethics of research in this type of situations. I'm not going to speak only about COVID-19, although one of the examples is about COVID-19, of course. But these are similar situations. We're talking about how do you conduct research ethically in situations that are where there's a lot of pressure and where there's a lot of uncertainty, and also a lot of distress among people. So it's really a difficult situation to perform research in an ethical way. And it may to some extent be comparable to what Teguh was talking about. It may be comparable to parts of the situation in which you ask military personnel to participate. We will see what the similarities and the differences are. So this is one of the basic documents that I'm going to use in my talk. It's been issued just at the beginning of the year. I think it was just before the corona epidemic really got global. I think it was in January that the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, which is an important think tank in bioethics in the United Kingdom, issued a report about research in global health emergency. And that was talking about the main ethical issues. Now, I'll briefly go through that document, and there's several other things that I'll discuss. And then I have a few examples that I would really like to discuss with you, if that's possible, through this medium and at this distance. So what do the Nuffield Council consider the main ethical issues in global emergency research? They mention 5 things that they think are very important, and maybe they don't mention maybe the most important ethical issue that's always behind doing research with individuals in medicine, and that is the balance between the importance of doing research on the one hand, and the importance of protecting individual interests and individual preferences on the other hand. So the importance of autonomy on the one hand, maybe for individuals, versus the importance of doing the research. And that's a very important dilemma also in emergency research, in global emergencies, in epidemics like COVID-19, where it's really very important to do good research during the disaster. So during that period in which healthcare institutions, hospitals are flooded with patients, you still have to do research, and among all this distress and difficulty, research is still really necessary. So that's in fact a basic, I think, ethical issue, and I'll probably come back to that later on in my lecture. So the first issue that the Nuffield Council, I think, very rightfully stresses is the first ethical issue is about power and influence on research. So who in fact decides about which research is going to happen, when and how it's going to happen? Is that decided by the pharmaceutical companies that Teguh already mentioned, that have an interest in making drugs that they can sell, and which is not necessarily the interest of the population that is affected by the disaster. So the second question in this, let's say, bundle of questions about power and influence is how can we guarantee that the people who are most affected by the disaster have a voice in what type of research and what questions are answered, which is not necessarily the questions that the pharmaceutical industries or even governments, and especially international organizations, may want to answer. And what they say is to make sure that the research is in the interest of the people who you ask for the research. Community involvement is completely crucial. So you have to involve the community that is affected, and in the COVID-19 pandemic, that's infected every one of us, but maybe mainly the vulnerable people whom you want to find protection for should be involved, and that's a crucial part. I think it's very important that they stress this element of influence on what research is about. I mean, we already discussed that a little bit with Teguh in the previous talk. You can say that there may be a moral obligation for people to contribute to research if they can, but only if that research is also important for them. It's not you can't ask from people to contribute to research when it's completely irrelevant for them. So that's I think the first cluster of ethical issues. The second ethical issue is that you need a study design that fits with that takes into account the distress and the uncertainties and the massive healthcare needs. So what we've been discussing in the Netherlands is, can you do research in the situation that we were in April this year, where it was probable that hospitals and intensive care units would get completely overburdened with patients, and we've all seen those images from New York, from Italy in Europe, from China in the beginning of the epidemics, where hospitals where there was a sort of a constant panic. And how can you ever start doing research in that situation? So you need study designs that don't ask too much time and too much energy from people. In fact, you need study designs that would ask no energy, because all the energy in that situation has to go to saving and protecting the people that are affected. So that's the second point. So you have to have very modest designs. And we're not always doing that in normal situations. Sometimes studies really demand a lot from participants. You can't do that in emergency research. So as another point, and I'll come back to that a bit longer, and Teguh has been speaking about that, is what is meaningful consent? I mean, you can always ask consent to people, but I think the concept of meaningful consent is very important. We're always talking about informed consent. I think meaningful is the better term, because what you want to know is whether the consent that people give really means something. If they say yes, go ahead, do they have any idea about what they're consenting to? I'll get back to that on a different example. And then there are two other issues that they consider very important. I think we don't often think of those issues when we think about the ethics of research, which is mainly about informed consent and not burdening people too much. There's always also fairness toward local groups, because very often research in disaster areas or in local epidemics is conducted by people from outside of those communities. They may come from the United States and do research in Ebola areas. I'll have an example later on of that. So people come in and do their research, and then they may go back and they may completely disregard the local or regional or national research groups. Something like that may have happened in the tsunami areas in Aceh at the time, foreign people coming in doing research and leaving the area again with their results. And the last point that's really important, I think, is that we have in emergency research, very often there's a sort of a frontline workers who are often not very trained researchers. Sometimes they're even volunteers who have to recruit patients and who have to explain the research to them and who have to perform some of the research actions with the patients. So you need to support those often partially unskilled frontline workers in emergency research. So those are the five crucial things. And this is one of the examples that I found. It's directly from the report that that I mentioned by the Nuffield Council. And what they were talking about is they did mental health studies in the Syrian refugee camps during the Syrian war. And what they said is what you really need to do is train these volunteers in ethical research practices, and you have to create space to raise ethical issues, including debriefing them and really delineate their responsibility. So don't give them too much responsibility for things they're not trained for. And then again, they say you need to consult the local people and the local experts. So, and I think the last point is really important too. What we see sometimes in emergency situations is that people do data collection in very risky situations. And one of the issues always is that you really should prioritize the safety of these frontline workers in emergency research over the data collection. And that's been really an issue in COVID-19 research as well, where researchers may have been exposed to the coronavirus in times where there was not enough protection material, just to gather data from patients who were admitted to a hospital or who were staying at home. And I think that in the beginning, in some of the studies we did in the Netherlands about the corona situation, worker safety was sometimes sacrificed for the good of the research because there simply wasn't enough protection material. We're not in that situation anymore, so there is enough protection material, but I think there should be an absolute priority for worker safety. And worker safety, I mean researcher or the research over data collection. Okay, am I still connected? It's one of the difficult issues with this type of lectures that I don't know if I'm still connected.
You are still connected. We hear you clear. Yes.
I'm still connected, and I didn't, because sometimes connections get bad. Was there any instance of bad connections, or is everything going smoothly? Good.
Fine.
Good. Then I'll go on. I'll ask some questions to you later on. So that the Nuffield Council set up in their report about the kinds of things that you needed to take into account if you plan to do research in emergency issues such as the COVID-19 pandemics, but it's about, in fact, all types of disasters like tsunamis or big explosions or whatever, or the kind of things that they had in Beirut in the beginning of the year, or last year, the explosion in the port of Beirut. So these are issues that you need to consider if you're planning research in disaster areas. And in fact, they have three main guidelines, which are that you have to help reduce suffering through research. So you need to think about who are you helping with the research that you're doing, it will, for instance, one of the issues that's very important is when you're developing a drug or a vaccine in an emergency situation, will that drug ever reach the people that are in the research that you're doing? And if not, if you're sure that we had trials about very expensive anti-rheumatic drugs, and the question whether they could be useful for COVID-19 patients. I mean, you may have heard of that. I think it's the drug that the president that's fortunately leaving in the US, so Donald Trump, was taking when he had the COVID-19. In fact, I say fortunately, that's my personal conviction, of course. I mean, you're free to think about Trump whatever you want, but I'm not unhappy that he leaves. But he was taking that very expensive drug during his corona infection. So anyway, these are very expensive drugs, and I don't think you should test them in a situation where this drug will not be available for the group that are in the trial anyway. So help reducing suffering, fairness. So you have to distribute the burdens of the research equitably, and which is in fact linked to the same issue. So you don't do the research only in very underserved areas, because people may be more inclined to participate, because participating in research may be the only way for them to get to the drug. So distribute it fairly, help reducing the suffering, and have respect for the people that are involved. And respect includes respect for their autonomous decisions and their wishes with regard to participation in the research. So so this compass, I think, if you think about it, if the only thing you will get from this lecture is this image of a moral, an ethical compass when doing the research, then I would be quite happy if this is what you learn. And I hope I can give the presentation to Bagas and Amalia, of course, and I hope you'll have the time to look a little bit at this publication, which is very user friendly and very good, I think. So that would be a good idea. I think this is another document that I use in this presentation, which is a training manual for research in disaster areas that has been issued by the World Health Organization a couple of years ago. So this is way before the COVID-19 pandemic, and it's also a source of very good information about how to ethically do research. I'm going to go back a little bit to the general principles of performing ethically acceptable research involving patients. So I'm not talking obviously about laboratory research, but it's really about research involving human beings. And this is, in fact, the basis of the whole story. I mean, this is what the World Medical Association, so the World Association of Doctors, has taken as their principles, ethical principles for medical research. And in fact, this is a very short, very brief summary of what these ethical principles are. And they start with a very important point. I think it's really on the basis of everything. And that is that considerations related to the well-being of the subject or the participants in the research are always more important than the interest of science and society, which means that you never have the right to sacrifice the well-being of the human subject to the science unless that subject or the participant agrees to that. So if a participant says, I'm willing to undergo painful medical procedures in the interest of medical science, then you're allowed to do that. But otherwise, you're never allowed to do that. And these are a few. I'm not going to walk through them because that's a separate lecture. I hear other sounds there. Yeah. I think we'll come back to some of them, but I think one of the really important issues is that patients who are asked to participate really should have the opportunity to refuse, and that's obviously the problem with the military that Teguh was talking about. So they should be informed, and as I said, I think meaningful is maybe a more important term than informed, a better term than informed consent, which should be free, so there should be no pressure on the people. And that's a very difficult thing to realize, especially in emergency situations. And there should be no disadvantages for those who refuse. So you can't say to people, you're free to refuse, but you won't get the drug if you don't participate. Something like that is not possible. So these are two quotes from that declaration, and it says that every research project should be preceded by a careful assessment of risks and burdens in comparison with possible benefits to the participants or to patients that have the same disease. That's a basic thing, I think. And it's only justified, I already said that when there's a reasonable likelihood that the people who are asked to participate also benefit from the results of the research. Those are two, I think, very important clauses from that Helsinki Declaration. So I think that in disaster research, medical research in disasters, many of these Helsinki principles, I think all of them still apply, but some things are under pressure in these situations. And the first thing is the enormous time pressure very often. So in the COVID pandemic, there has been this huge time pressure in which research projects had to start very, very quickly. And we've seen that in the development of vaccines. As you know, there are vaccines that have been developed and that are already used in some countries in the world, and they have been developed at an extraordinary speed. There's never been such fast development of vaccines, and that time pressure may put the ethics under extra pressure. So there's always a tendency to not adhere to the ethical guidelines because you need to go fast. And we've seen that everywhere, that there's a time pressure and that it's very important, but also very difficult to stick to the ethical guidelines. But it's also true that it's possible to do that. You have to be more flexible, but there's no reason to leave the ethical principles behind. One of the issues is that good preclinical studies are often lacking, and risks and burdens are not very well known at the beginning of the trial. Usually before you test a drug or before you test a vaccine, there's been a long period of studies, preclinical studies in animals or in laboratories, and even with volunteer human participants. But all that is not possible in a disaster period. And there's obviously the issue of consent under pressure of the disaster. One of the things that you often see in disaster research is that researchers are, as I already said, scarcely trained volunteers. And in disaster areas, they may be village neighbors. I think we've seen that in the research that's been done in the Aceh tsunami area a couple of years ago. So there may be very important privacy issue. If your neighbor asks you to participate and you have to do an interview with him about what's happening, then there may be privacy issues. Research integrity also may be under pressure as a consequence. So researchers may be less strict with their integrity in a disaster Syria. So let me go to the informed and free consent. And the basic idea is that patients should have a genuine choice. So they should be able to refuse, and there may be no coercion, and they need comprehensible information about why the research is performed, what the risks and the burdens are, and what the benefits may be. Now I'm going to jump, I think, I have a first example that I'd really like to think about a little bit too. And that example is about a biobank. We have, and like I know that in Indonesia, there are many hospitals that have biobanks as well. And we had, in the beginning of the epidemics in Holland, our hospital wanted to set up a COVID-19 biobank. And the aim of that biobank was to obtain blood and possibly tissue samples and data from all patients that were admitted to the hospital with COVID-19. And that included there a DNA sample. And there was no specific research question at that time. All they wanted to do, and they wanted to have permission for that, in fact, from the start of the epidemic. So as soon as patients started to get into the hospital, researchers wanted to start this biobank. And that would include patients from the wards, but also patients who were admitted to intensive care units. And one of the issues, of course, here is that informed consent would be impossible to obtain in the ICU because, as you know, these people are all heavily sedated. It's absolutely impossible to get their informed consent. So it would be needed to get in our legal system, you need to have consent from the family, but it's very, very difficult to ask this kind of consent from a distressed family who are watching, and they couldn't even be present all the time. They know that their next of kin is struggling for his or her life in the intensive care unit, and they need to answer questions about informed consent for a biobank. We felt that that was almost too much burden to ask from family members who were in this very distressful situation. And then there's another problem with this biobank is that we knew, especially in the beginning, many patients, the majority, in fact, of the beginning of the pandemic, did not survive ICU admission. So there would be no consent from them. And the question then was, should you ask consent after the death of the patient from the families that were extremely distressed after their death and a very traumatic period before that death? So I would like very much, if there's anyone from the audience who has any ideas about that. Should we ask families for consent for a biobank from when their next of kin has died in the ICU? What do you think about this? Should we ask that type of consent? Does anyone have an idea about that?
Okay, please feel free to answer, or if you have any opinion.
What do you think, Amalia?
Well, I think as I understand what you said, how researchers might be, or we as researchers will feel hesitant to ask to patients, to patients' families, as I don't know. Well, if I were the family, one of the family of the patient, I would not object, or I would just say, I would say, please do take the blood samples, because it's first of all, it's important for the science itself, but also that it doesn't do any further harm to what I understood from your explanation is to the patient. So I think, why not take the blood sample? And I don't think if we I'm not sure if we ask families afterwards, after the patient has died, if it's necessary, because I mean, if it only bring them burden, or not burden, how is it, like
more distress, maybe that was the word. Yeah.
That's what
So
I think.
Sorry, if I may add on, and Azwani here from Malaysia.
Yes. Oh, thank you.
Good to
Very nice.
listen to you again, Prof. And for someone who, because I'm now involved directly with the control of COVID-19, and for Malaysia state currently situation, and COVID-19 is something like a very stigmatization. So and for us in Research Ethics Committee, and we would like to have clear researchers understanding, and do not and avoid giving this stress to the family. And so the timing of informed consent is very important, not to stimulate any distress from the families. And so we really look into whether there is a good research question, and then on the how and the timing on the informed consent. And because for Malaysia population, the families of the COVID-19 patients are very stressful, very distressed, and the stigmatization is very high. So
yes.
Maybe it's a difference between population to population, but that is the state in Malaysia nowadays.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much. I think we in Amsterdam came to the same conclusion, that we had the idea that it would be very burdensome for families to be asked for consent for something that wouldn't have any consequence for the patient or for the family, because the patient had already died, so he couldn't, or he or she couldn't be harmed anymore. And these were things that we know from other research that we performed, that that families usually say that they wouldn't want to be asked because they would consent anyway. They would have no objections. The problem is that it puts the burden on the researchers a lot more. So if you do this without the consent of the family, then you have to be sure that the research is valid and is important, and is something that would really be in the interests of patients. So in fact, the let's say the demands that you put on the research itself become more important if you can't ask patients or families if they want to participate. So I fully agree with you, Nuraswati, that the research question then has to be really very important, and really relevant for these people as well. So I think this issue came back for a lot of times, whether we should ask patients and families, or families of deceased patients, about their informed consent afterwards in this very stressful situation. I'm going to jump to a different situation, and that's about a vaccine trial in Liberia during the Ebola epidemics there. And this is all based on a PhD that has been performed at the University of Amsterdam. I was fortunate enough to be in the assessment committee of this PhD, and that was a study into how the ethics of research was preserved in a vaccine trial in a very underprivileged, poor area in Monrovia in Liberia during this Ebola vaccine was conducted by an originally Russian researcher, Alexei Aleshinov, who did interviews with and did focus groups with participants in a vaccine trial around Ebola. And one of the issues that he was looking at is what informed consent really meant to the participants in the trial. And so he went there and he discussed that with quite a number of participants in the trial. And what he discovered is that the trial participants who gave informed consent to the trial understood completely different things than were mentioned in the informed consent leaflet, and different things than were discussed with them during the conversation about participation. Because what their reasons, what they understood from the informed consent, and what their reasons were to participate, is that they felt that a vaccination would give them general protection, overall protection to all kinds of diseases, not only Ebola, also other infectious diseases. So they had a general idea about vaccination, and they had very powerful metaphors for what the vaccine did. So there were all kinds of narratives around the vaccine that made them decide to participate, and that were sometimes not at all related to what was in the information leaflet. So his question was, so they had completely different conceptions of what vaccination is from what the Western researchers had about vaccination. So he said they had different conceptions. He said, you can say they were wrong, but that's from a Western perspective. They had very strong conceptions that may not have been wrong in their view of the world, in their view of life, but different from what the researchers thought. So his question was, is this really informed consent, or is it something else? And how can we take into account, when we ask for informed consent, of these conceptions that people bring in, and that the way they give meaning, and I come back to that issue of meaningful consent. For these people involved in the vaccine trial, their consent was meaningful, even though they did almost nothing with the information that was given. So it may not have been informed consent according to our ideas about informed consent, but for them it was completely meaningful. So that's one of the reasons why I think in these type of situations, meaningful consent is a more important concept than informed consent. And that was also the conclusion of Alexei in that study. It's a beautiful study that he published about. So if you ever have time and if you're interested, this is a study that you should look at. It was a very well done study. These are some of the images that I took from his book. So and he agrees with me taking these images from the book, where he showed the difference between the situation where the trial was done, which are the two left side images, and the situation where it was designed. And this is the conference room, also in Monrovia, where the research committee, the research unit, the conference room of the research unit, where the researchers came together. So he said there was a really big difference, and it was difficult to get these two worlds together, in fact, in the vaccine trial. I think one of the issues, and you already mentioned that, was stigmatization in the trial. And that's an issue that we don't have that much in the West, but it's very important. I know from Amalia and Bagas and others that in Indonesia, stigmatization also plays an important role around the COVID-19 pandemic. So these are two quotes from, I don't know if you can read them, but they told Alexei that the participants said that people around them got afraid of them. There was really stigma on participation in the vaccination trial, because one of the things was that people said that they were taking the vaccine for money because they were compensated, and obviously in a very poor area like Monrovia, like the part of Monrovia where this was done, money was an important reason to participate. So it may not have been untrue that the money did play a role for the participants. But the most important stigma was that people thought that these people had got the Ebola vaccine, the Ebola virus injected into them, and that they would become contagious because of that, and that they would kill the people around them. So some of the people were really avoiding the research participants that had been in the trial because of this stigma of becoming dangerous for them. And what Alexei, the researcher, said is they were considered dangerous because the image was that they were injected with the live virus, so that they were given the disease and would transmit it to others. And there were a lot of it was linked, I said liked here, but I meant linked. They were linked to conspiracy theories about the vaccine. So one of the theories that one of the rumors that went around in the disaster areas was that this vaccination and even the Ebola infection itself was invented by Western people to kill Africans. I mean, they're always this type of conspiracy theories. I don't know if you have them in Indonesia, but we have plenty of them in the West as well, where there's the idea that the COVID-19 vaccine contains microchips inserted by Bill Gates, who wants to monitor all of us. So and there's wild conspiracy theories, and they're probably always around if there's a disaster. But it's very difficult to combat them. And his conclusion finally was that it's almost impossible to combat these stigmas. So even though they tried all kinds of forms of community engagement to dissipate these fears, but it's still almost impossible. And that's because they fit into the history of Liberia in this case, in the history of Monrovia, and in the whole societal system. So that's one of the reasons why this type of stigma is very, very difficult to deal with, and should be taken into account when you set up a trial in this kind of environment. You need to know what the views of the community are, and what types of theories and rumors are circulating in that community. I have a second example just to show you. Maybe we have time to ask your opinions on this. This is an example from the WHO handbook on research in disaster areas that I showed in the beginning, and this was a trial that was conducted in Africa as well. It was not the Ebola virus, but another one. But the aim of this particular trial was, in fact, the aim was to facilitate access to a new vaccine. because the aim was to get people to have people participate in vaccination through a research project. So it should be research, but the main aim was to get the vaccine into to the affected areas, because it would not be available, and it would not be it would be too expensive for those communities, the people in those communities, to pay for. So the aim of the trial was to facilitate access. And there was enormous time pressure, because this was one of these exploding epidemics that had to be contained as soon as possible. So in that situation, there was the trial protocol was submitted to an ethics committee, and the idea was that a subcommittee would be formed consisting of the essential disciplines in an ethics committee, but smaller. And the review process, which usually takes months, as those who do research will be aware of, it takes months to do that kind of assessments. So here the idea was that it should be reviewed within a week so that it could start immediately. And this would be largely virtual. I mean, they would largely do this through email. And as I already mentioned, very often preclinical studies are absent. So what they wanted to do here, because it wasn't considered an emergency situation, and the idea is that if you don't do this, people would die from the disease. So it's really an emergency. You have two bad choices, in fact. Either have them participate in the trial and have a chance of saving their lives, or do nothing and let them die from the infection. So that was in fact, the reasoning of the researchers. You should start the trial, even though animal studies have not been finalized. And it would be community-based, so there would be a lot of community effort to get people to participate in the trial. And one of the issues here was that there would not be a complete consent from participants for the enrollment. They would have information, but in fact, participation would be considered normal, the default. So there would not be complete consent, and that was motivated by the idea that would be the only way to save the community. And there would be a public health campaign and everything, but consent, they thought, would be impossible, individual consent. So I don't know if there's any comment on this setup, if you think this is an ethically valid, if you can start doing this in a community where this virus is raging. Does anyone have a comment on that? Can you do it this way, or is there something that really should be different?
Very interesting, Dick. Any comments from anyone?
Is it difficult? Is it a difficult question? Maybe the question is too difficult, but Amalia, what or Bagas or any of the others?
Yeah, and Azwani here. And if in Malaysia, when we look into our research ethics committee's decision, and whatever we want to do, we have to also make sure on the safety. Of course, and we are saying that the aim of the trial is facilitate access. So in public health research, if the aim is facilitate access to the new vaccine, then it is not a research, it is a service. So we have to really distinguish between service and research in public health setting. So there's a lot of papers talking about distinguishing between public health non-research and public health research, and the ethics is different. So in this case, as the aim of the trial is facilitate as access, then it is not, and with trials started before animal study finalized, then it is jeopardizing the safety of the recipient. And even though the intention is good in terms of giving vaccine, but the vaccine is not finalized even at animal study. So we still put the safety first and of the participants first before the intention of the trial or the access. Because if you give access, it goes back to the principles of beneficence and malfeasance.
Right. I completely agree with you, but and obviously this was what the ethics committee brought into and said to the researchers: you shouldn't do a trial before you're convinced of the safety of the vaccine. And then the researchers said, well, if you don't do the trial now, they have a high chance of dying anyway. So their safety is compromised anyway from the virus. So they were quite reluctant to wait for the animal studies, because they said we need to act now in the interest of that community. And I don't know what you would say about that argument, because it's quite hard, I think. If you can take,
I have a question actually, because I was wondering about the trial. If they are so convinced that it's safe for the subjects, why are the animal studies so important for the reviewer? I mean, so I was wondering why, but you explained a bit about that, that they were quite certain about it, but it's just, I was just wondering about that. And a second is, if the main aim is to facilitate access, could it be justifiable if we use research as a cover for that?
No, just the first. I'll answer both of them. The first is they were not sure that the vaccine was completely safe, because they also said, in fact, to be convinced of the safety, we would need finished animal studies. But they said, we just don't have the time for that. And if we do nothing, maybe the whole community will be wiped out by the virus. So what they essentially said is, we need to sacrifice a little bit of our high standards of safety in the emergency situation, because the alternative, and that's a very difficult ethical discussion, the alternative is that the community may be wiped out by the virus. So that was their main reason. They knew that they were not convinced enough of the safety of the vaccine. And I think there's a way out of this, because I in fact, I agree with them, but it may be a difficult dilemma sometimes. If you're really in an emergency situation, you've nothing to offer, then could you do a trial even though you're not completely convinced that you're not 100% sure of safety? And I think you usually shouldn't do that. And what we've seen in the recent trials with the vaccines for COVID-19, that I think safety standards have been held up, even though there was there was a lot of time pressure. And then to the first issue, facilitating access can never be an aim of a trial. So I really completely agree with both of you that as soon as you do that, you get into something that we call seeding trials in regular trials. Because sometimes pharmaceutical industries just try to use trials as a way to get their drugs marketed. So then trials are parts of marketing. And this looks very much alike. You facilitate the access. In fact, you want to market or to sell your trial to a community by using it in a trial that's not really a trial, because the science is not the basic idea. It's it's spreading the vaccine. So I completely agree with the first point. You can't do this if that's your aim. But the safety issue, I think, is a difficult one and is a real dilemma. And the ethics committee that assessed this trial was really having a hard time. But they didn't, finally, in the long run, they didn't agree with the trial. So it wasn't accepted in this way. So it had to wait for animal studies to be finalized more quickly than you usually do. But there had to be enough certainty about the safety as well. I think I'm talking about time pressure here, and I'm under time pressure myself, I think. So I'm not going to address all these things. And I've been already talking about consent and about privacy issues. I had another example, but this is my conclusion. I think research under disaster conditions should and can still involve ethical scrutiny, have to be done conform to ethical principles, but there's in fact you need to account for time pressure, you need to account for the degree of population risk, and you need to involve the communities that are most affected by the disease. So that was in fact the end of what I had to say this morning. Thank you very much for listening. And I see that there's still I didn't scare all of you off, because there's still quite a lot of participants that are still here, which is nice.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dick. Actually, there are a few questions. Do you still have time? How many minutes?
I still have time. If you still have time, I still have time.
I have some comment on what was on example 2.
Sure. Teguh, silakan.
So I'd like to point out on the comment of the researchers when they say that, well, if you don't do that now, they will be exposed to the risks anyway, right? So so I've been rather liberal, in my view, in this sense, being dragged with really sort of impatience with how things have been very slow, and whether we are being unethical in being slow itself. Well, now let's take it this way. Which drugs which have past regulatory approval, in which we are 100% certain that it is safe? None. I think no drugs which has get into regulatory approval that we have a complete assurance in terms of their efficacy and safety. Safety is the key here. And then on the other hand, we have this problem of emergency, really. Then the questions from the researcher.
I'm sorry, which problem of what you say?
Problem of safety. Safety.
Yeah.
Okay.
Problem of safety is real here. So, but the statement of the researchers that, well, they will be exposed to the risk anyway. So then that's also something real. So I think this is a question of risk and benefit. Really, I think this is a question of really a risk and benefit. And I'm not thinking that we have been very thorough in terms of weighing between the risk and benefit in many research when it concerns the pandemic. I think we've been very much fixed with the way how things should be done according to the steps which we have always been doing. So yeah, well, but that's just my complaints. I don't really have a precise solutions on that, really. But no. I think, yeah, again, we need to be very careful looking at the risk and benefit in that sense.
Yes. Maybe.
Yeah.
Do you want me to answer immediately, or do we first collect questions and then? But that's. So,
if I can,
brief answer. Sorry.
If I can add on a little bit, when they say that if they didn't start giving the vaccine, then the people can die from the disease itself. And it is not that in accordance to the control measures for epidemic, because in epidemic, vaccine is not the first measures of control, but the first measure of control is other things like the social behavior control, like in COVID, we do all those social distancing and the face mask and all those things. So, and the public health intervention in terms of the social behavioral and everything is the first line of control measures, not the vaccine. And thus with that and evidence and because now in Malaysia, we're also looking into the vaccine now. And our mainstay is that because there are other control measures under the principle of least coercive, is that we can impose the other measures first, and thus the vaccine safety will have to be the first. And that means they have to have evidence on safety first, because the others we still have other measures.
Yes. So I think those are two really valid comments, and I think to answer to the last point, of course, what in fact you're saying is that the reasoning that they will die anyway, so that they have that risk anyway, is not valid, because there are other ways. So, and I think that's really, I'm very happy you say this, because I think this was in one of the responses of the ethics committees as well. They said, you're saying that we have no choice, or the choice is between dying from the epidemics or taking the risk of the vaccine. There are other possibilities. So this reasoning is not valid enough. And I think what's important here also is a distinction between risks that are completely unknown. And in fact, in this situation, you must say that the risk of the vaccine is really unknown. It may even be bigger than the risk of not applying it. And sometimes we have a situation in which we know that a drug or a treatment has a severe risk of side effects and even sometimes of death. But then you know that that's a risk. And in some very serious disease, you will still try that drug because otherwise you have no other possibility. But then you're talking about known risk. And I think it's almost always unacceptable to do a trial where there is no good knowledge about how high the risk is. And obviously, as Teguh says, there's no 100% certainty, because usually the risk is one of the questions of the research. So we don't know how high the risk is, but we need to have as much information as we can about risks. And that was what was not available in this example. Now, there are quite a lot of questions, I think.
Yes, we have.
What do you want me to do?
Yeah, first is from Imran Khalid, for both of you, actually, for Teguh and Dick. Would you like to elaborate more on how evidently the term meaningful consent is used in the literature? I think that's the first.
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, I've been saying a lot about meaningful consent as opposed to informed consent, and I think, well, what we see in the literature is when people speak about meaningful, there is a lot of literature about it, and when we speak about meaningful consent, we focus more on the extent to which people can explain why they participate in a trial on their own terms, because it is something that fits within the way they interpret things and fits with their life. Then you sometimes, but so informed in meaningful consent, you're more focused on how people fit it into their own lives. Then if it may be less important if they completely understand all the details and all the medical technicalities. It's how they think about it in their own lives. I must say that it also has a risk, because sometimes, of course, people participate in the trial because of what we call the therapeutical misconception, because they think that if they participate in the trial, they will be cured, and that may not be the case at all. There may be only a very small chance, and that so meaningful consent should not lead to therapeutic misconceptions, but it is a way to understand, to have more understanding and more respect for the reasons that people have to participate. And there is quite a lot of ethical literature. If you just in PubMed use meaningful consent, there's quite some literature about it. But it's essentially about how they integrate it in their own story. Then about clinical research. Oh yes, that's about the evaluation from yes. About clinical research with superior subordinate, military teaching students. How's the beneficence issue conducting with the research result? I wonder that the participant is more in than the broader society. Yes. Well, thank you. That's a very good question too. Maybe Teguh, you're back, aren't you?
Yeah. Well,
maybe that's a question for you more than for me.
Yeah, there are two questions about this actually from Ranga and Hilal.
Oh yeah, I see.
Yeah.
Two. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes.
I'd like to start first from the first question. Really, when I give lectures on informed consent to my students, there are two cases that I usually give. The example of the Havasupai Indian case for the DNA samples, and then the example of how meaningful consent is actually very important when you go to when you have to face a court case, really, because in meaningful, really, when you really have to go to court, what matters is the meaningful consent. It's not the signature of anyone on that piece of paper. Really, it's whether people really understand and what is written there, what you are going to do to their body, to their sample, and so on. Yeah, the case of if you want to look more detail into that, you can just Google it, Havasupai Indian case. So that gives a whole lot of example about how things like this can actually go wrong, go very wrong. And then number two, yeah, true. Of course, when you recruit only from the military, the personnel, the biological variations will be very, very homogeneous. You wouldn't expect them to have the variability they would expect in the real population when you recruit from the military personnel. So what we see here is not only the problem, the ethical issues, but also the methodological issues. When you can hardly get representative sampling, is what you need to do from the actual the real population. And then number three, how is the difference of ethical issues between clinical research associated with COVID disease and those non-COVID disease in this pandemic period? What we must anticipate most, especially in observational research population, right? Well, I guess this goes back to you, Dick.
Yeah, I understand. Well, I think there are a number of things. One of them is that what's different. I mean, the ethical principles, and that's what I've been trying to say, that we have from the Helsinki Declarations are not different. I mean, we have the same principles, and we should really take care that it's still from those principles that we assess, even in these emergency situations, what's happening to participants in research, whether they are observational or interventional research. But this, as I try to explain this, there's one of the issues is the time pressure on the assessment. So there's very little time sometimes to look closely at the research, because it has to start almost immediately. So that's one of the things. But maybe more importantly, the difference, I think, there may be three differences. One of them is that quite many patients that have COVID disease become incompetent to give consent. So that was really, especially when you do observational research in intensive care units or on hospital wards, there. And the second, so difficulty deciding is one. The other one, I think, is the huge distress around this disaster, and that's common to all disaster research. People are emotionally distressed, which is stronger sometimes than in non-COVID research often. So that's something to take into account. And finally, I think, and that may apply in some areas more than in others, is the stigma around the disease, which may have influence on the extent to which people are prepared to participate in this kind of research. So those may be the three main differences, but as I said, the basic principles and values are not different, to my view. Are there more questions? Because I saw a next slide as well, I think, or not?
Yes, there are 6 questions. I think Woro has the next. Yes, okay. This is the 4th question, is how does ethics put itself in a vaccine issue that is also influenced by the political policies of a country, people, even companies for profit?
If I can start answering, maybe Teguh has something to say about this too. This is a really, really good question. I mean, and I mean, it's so true that if we only look at specific trials and specific research projects and forget about the context in which this all happens, then ethics is very powerless. I mean, then we're looking at details while we forget the bigger picture. And I think you really point to an issue that has to be addressed all the time. So, and I think what the Nuffield Council report that I referred to in the beginning does very well is that they put the ethics in this much larger perspective. So what they say is you should, first of all, look at who has the, and that's why they put the power issue at the top. So you have to look at who decides about what research is performed, and who decides about which populations are involved, and these are often political decisions. They may be related to international politics, where some companies for some countries are let into a country to do research and others are not, and it may be related to the interests of pharmaceutical industries. I think in the last example that I showed you about the vaccine and whether you should, and the animal studies, there was a powerful interest of the industry that was producing the vaccines, and I don't have a definitive answer on this, but I think that in the discussions about ethics of research, we are very much focusing on individual research projects and individual participants, and sometimes forget about the discussion about this context, which really should be part of any ethical assessment. And it relates to the issue of involving the people who are affected by the disaster. So thank you very much for the question, for pointing again to how important that political and commercial context is.
Yeah. The next question is concerning vulnerable people. Is there a difference in treating the person in a state of pandemic and non-pandemic in terms of priorities? Yeah, that's the main question.
So, Teguh, are you going to take up other questions or? Oh no, the last one is for you. That's about the military. So, all right, okay. Yeah, the vulnerable people in terms. I'm not so. I mean, when we're talking about vulnerable people, we may talk, for instance, speak about the very old. That's been a discussion in our country a lot, whether research and vaccines should be directed to the very old or to people with specific vulnerabilities. And I think most of the research effectively goes to those groups now. So I think if I would say anything, then I think we should look at the extent to which the research really helps the people that are most affected, and those are usually the more vulnerable people. So much of the research that has been initiated in my country about related to the COVID-19 pandemics was especially related to the people who had a high risk to end up on the intensive care unit and to spend lots of time there and get off either dead or with severe morbidity still. So I think we have to have the tendency, and I think it's an ethical issue that we really should look at the people who are most affected, and those are the most vulnerable people. If that's an answer, but thank you very much for that question too. It's a really, really important question to raise.
Yeah. Thank you, Dick. I think the sixth question is similar to the second question, if I'm not mistaken. Is it? Yeah, I think it has been discussed because there is another question concerning. Okay, so let me see. Yeah, so this is the question is a bit long, but
yeah, we'll read it. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So Dick, as you maybe so the situation is in Indonesia is that the vaccine has just arrived in Indonesia, and there's a huge debate about who will get the vaccine first. And what I heard is that the healthcare workers would be prioritized to get the vaccine, but in fact they are. I think that most of them are not in favor of getting the vaccine, and people say that the president and the higher people should get it first. And so that is, I think, related to the that people are in doubt of how the vaccine will be, the quality of the vaccine, and so on.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I have views on this. This is not so much related to research ethics, but more to justice and in a lack of vaccine. You know, we obviously there's only 50 countries, apparently 50 countries in the world that will have the vaccine, but you must realize that even inside those countries, the vaccine will not be available for everybody who needs it in the next couple of months. We will. The Netherlands is one of those 50 countries that will have the vaccine, but we've had a huge debate as well about who should get it, because it will not be available for all of us in any short period. And we've had the same discussion about, and there's been a debate about whether we should give the vaccine first to those who are most vulnerable, and then to healthcare personnel, and then to the rest of the population, which would protect the most vulnerable. Both of them. If you vaccinate the healthcare personnel, you will also protect the people that they care for, which are also the most vulnerable. So the other choice would be that you give it to the young, because as we know, young people are the main spreaders of the virus now. So if you want to contain the epidemic, it may be more logical and more rational to vaccinate the young. And that's really an ethical issue. Do we do the vaccination to stop the pandemic, or do we do it to protect the most vulnerable? And in our country, the decision has been taken to do it to protect the most vulnerable, which means that healthcare personnel and vulnerable people will be vaccinated first, and the rest of the population will have to wait for half a year or a year before they get vaccinated. And then about the president, we have the same discussion. I think the main reason to have the president vaccinated first may not be because he's very vulnerable. I hope for you he's not. I think he's not very vulnerable at the moment. But we are discussing the same thing, but then in terms of setting the example, because there's quite a lot of resistance and people who don't want to have the vaccine, also among healthcare personnel. So what is the discussion now is whether it shouldn't be given first to, let's say, the chairs of the boards of hospitals and the prime minister and the minister of health, just to set the example. And that's what's happening in the US, as you know, where Barack Obama and Bill Clinton and George W. Bush will get the vaccine in public as among the first to get it. So those are two discussions. But I think we have chosen for the most vulnerable as the first group. And of course, the justice issue has to be solved for the countries that don't get the vaccine now. And that's just a question of putting money into it and not saying, I've been speaking about Donald Trump maybe too much, but not keeping the vaccine for the country that has developed it. I mean, that's maybe the biggest injustice that could happen around this vaccine. And it fortunately won't happen because he's not the president anymore. But, well, I'm sorry for my political, I mean, it has to do with politics, all of this.
Yeah, yes, it does, yes.
Yeah, suggest that to state officials, well, that's what I suggested. That's a discussion in our country as well, that if the people are going to believe that the vaccine is safe, if the prime minister himself and the minister of health will take it. And well, you can say that it's, I don't feel that there's a lot of ethical trouble with that. If you think that there's also a lot of misconceptions about the vaccine, then this doesn't harm many people because it's only a few people who get the vaccine. And it may have quite a lot of good effects, but you may differ in this. Maybe Teguh has another, or any of you has another opinion on this.
Yeah, Teguh, do you have any opinions about this? Or are you still there?
Teguh's actually telling me that he has to go somewhere just for a moment. So maybe we have to wait him to go back.
Okay.
Yeah, or maybe you can answer this last question.
Yeah, well,
from Giovanni.
I think the problem here is the trust to our government. So people are saying that, like you said earlier, that high officials should take it first, or the president. But in terms of the officials, even not only the president, but also the whole parliament should take it first, which is a lot of people. And that is, I think I don't know how many or how many people like in percentage trust the vaccine or and not, but the media is more into that people do not trust the vaccines.
Yeah.
But I don't know how it is. Yeah, well, it's that's what I know.
Yeah, you know, the question is, of course, whether it will convince people if the president takes it, and whether it will convince people. Some people may be convinced because they may say that if he takes the risk, then I can take the risk, or then there will be no big risk. But not everybody will be convinced probably. So I'm not sure it's going to work, but
I think the problem is the big problem is that healthcare personnel are mostly not in favor of or having the vaccine, and that is a big problem if it is actually important for other people. So yeah, I don't know how it is in the Netherlands, but I think how is it that do health personnel?
We have the same discussion. I mean, there's been a brief survey among healthcare professionals, and there was I think quite a big proportion of healthcare professionals who said they were not going to take the vaccine, and those are mainly professionals who think that the vaccine has been developed too quickly to be certain about the safety, and that's the reason, of course, that you see in the media as well.
Yeah.
And I think it's disquieting. I mean, it's really. So we're now starting campaigns from the Dutch Medical Association and from the nursing associations that inform professionals about the safety of the vaccine and about the importance of taking it. But we have exactly the same problem here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And we also have, because here, older people are one of the groups that will be vaccinated first. And there's quite a few older people who say, I don't want me to be vaccinated first. Vaccinate the young first, because they also sometimes die from the disease. And I've had my life, why don't you vaccinate the young first? Which I found a very interesting response from older people. But not everybody says that, of course.
Interesting.
Now, maybe I'll have to go in a few minutes. So
yes, I think we're also I think it's time for us to maybe close this. Are there any more questions, Bagas Alvaro? No. Okay.
No, I think all of the questions has been answered, and maybe Pak Teguh is already back here.
Oh, hi. Yes. Yeah, Teguh, do you have any opinion? Just very shortly, we have, 3 minutes?
And that was on the last issue, whether politicians should function as examples in the vaccination.
Yes, true. Okay, let me comment on the first question that I see. I saw just now the last 2 questions.
Yeah.
Well, I'm interested with a principle, with one Islamic principles in terms of wealth. So the question comes from Dr. Saifuddin, which I know very well him. It says that in everyone's wealth, there's always rights of the public, rights of others. If I have in everyone's fortunes, in everyone's wealth, there's always a rights. There's always rights, some portion of it, rights for others. So, which means that stress the importance of sharing resources. So then I think there is a moral what to say in those 50 nations perhaps to then help the other the rest 150 in terms of the affordability, in terms of the accessibility to vaccines. That's why we know now there is a certain, really there is a initiative towards that, COVAX, for example, that have been working towards that directions. And the last questions about whether politicians should go first to get vaccinated. There are 2 different sides on this argument. One is that whether they have to be vaccinated first because they are the VIPs of the country, so therefore they have to be rescued first. There's also one side on that, but also there's another side on that. You are the leader, so if there is something wrong with the vaccine, you should die first, rather than us see, we see these balanced arguments in that statements. Well,
yeah,
that should go to the policymakers, I suppose. Right.
mm-hmm.
Thank you.
It's a bit the reasoning of the captain who doesn't leave the ship that's sinking.
Yeah.
He should stay on the ship, so he should participate, and he shouldn't jump off. And so,
true.
Yeah, I think those are the two reasons. Yeah.
Okay, well, very nice discussion, very interesting questions and discussions. I think it's time for us to say goodbye for now.
Yeah,
so thank you very much, Dick and Teguh, for your interesting lectures. And we hope to see you again, hopefully, some other time.
Yeah.
Thank you. Nice meeting
hopefully
you all.
too, yeah.
Thank you
and thank you very much for the questions, which I think were really interesting questions. A really good discussion. I'm really happy.
Yeah, thank you for all the participants here from Indonesia and Malaysia, who Aswani also. Yeah, I think that's it for now. Selamat siang. Good morning, Dick. Selamat pagi. For it.
Yes. The sun has just come up here. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.